Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and governing council of the Miller Center, I'm Bill Antholis, and I want to thank you and welcome you to the William C. Battle Symposium on American Diplomacy. Bill Battle was a Charlottesville native and UVA grad who served in World War II in the same Navy squadron as John F. Kennedy. Bill would go on to run then Senator Kennedy's successful presidential campaign in Virginia and would become ambassador to Australia. Each year, thanks to his family's generosity, we hold a symposium in his honor. This is at least the third that I know of that we have held on Russia. This year's event is also supported by the generosity of the George and Judy Marcus Praxis Fund, for which we are deeply grateful. While the selection of topic may seem obvious this year, the groundwork for today was laid, like many things here in the last few years, over Zoom. In early March, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the suggestion of Christina Lopez Guittardi-Chow, we began holding weekly Ukraine War Room Zoom discussions with a diverse group of Miller Center faculty and fellows and other faculty from across the University of Virginia. Each week, early in the morning, sometimes several times a week, experts from several departments in the College of Arts and Sciences, the Law School, the Darden School of Business, the Batten School of Public Policy and Leadership, as well as Miller Center faculty and fellows would get together. These would be open, free-flowing discussions off the record, and we started inviting guests and started doing public events. We all drew such enlightenment and energy from one another and from the few invited guests and our governing council members who often joined us that we have met every single week for over 8 months, including across the entire summer, which, if you know academics, is truly an unusual feat. Those discussions led to a stream of essays and op-eds, public events, and have contributed to public discussions about the war, its broader implications for Europe, for the global economy, and for geopolitics. Those contributions have made their ways to senior officials in Washington, to the UN in New York, to Kiev, to Moscow, and to many other locales. Today's discussions are modeled after those war room talks. The format is similar, with experts weighing in on issues in their area of expertise, which they find pressing to the conflict in a Socratic seminar-style discussion. Again, many thanks to Christina, not just for shepherding the war room for 8 months, but also for leading the design and build team for today's conference, working with Alfred Reeves, Grady Martins, and our entire event and AV team here at the Miller Center. Our first panel this morning will focus on the state of the war and the future of Europe. We cannot ask for better panelists, not to mention our respondents. We only have an hour, so I'm going to be brief in the introductions, but I could go on and on and on. I'll start with Heather Connolly in her first visit to the Miller Center that I know of. Have you been here before? It's great to have you with us. Heather is the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, of which I am an alumnus. Ms. Connolly has served as vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, with a special emphasis on Europe, NATO, and the former Soviet Union. She's served in government, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and as a GMF alumni myself. It's a real pleasure to welcome you. Eric Edelman is a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, former ambassador to Turkey, former ambassador to Finland, as well as stints working directly for Vice President Cheney, Secretary of State George Shultz, Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. He's a Miller Center Practitioner Fellow and has served as our distinguished Schlesinger Professor. And along with Elliot Cohen, he is the co-host of the Shield of the Republic podcast, which the Bulwark produces in partnership with the Miller Center. William Taylor, who I've known for over 30 years as Bill Taylor, is former ambassador to Ukraine and vice president at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has served at the Department of Energy, the U.S. Senate in the office of Senator Bill Bradley, the Defense Department, and a series of positions at the State Department, including twice having served as our man in Kiev. He started his life of service as a West Point cadet and earned the Bronze Star in Vietnam for bravery, among other awards. Bill is so gifted in so many things, but his superpower is in combining diplomacy with development and security assistance to troubled regions, which has taken him from Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of the Soviet Union to Afghanistan, to the West Bank and Gaza, to Egypt and North Africa during the Arab Spring, and I've probably forgotten a few places in the middle there as well. Bill may actually know the battle lines in Eastern Ukraine better than any American official. Andrew Weiss is the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research on Russia and Eurasia. He has served at the Defense Department under President George H.W. Bush and the State Department and National Security Council staff under President Clinton. 1 year ago, Andrew wrote a Carnegie essay that went viral, accurately predicting that Russia would invade Ukraine. At the time, I asked Andrew on a scale of 1 to 10 how likely, and he said 11. Andrew never wavered in that prediction, and he has just published a graphic novel called Accidental Tsar, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin. If you have a prop, please deliver it. Mine hasn't arrived yet. Our moderator this morning was supposed to be Phil Potter. Phil is an associate professor of politics, director of the National Security Policy Center at UVA's Batten School, and also a university expert with the National Ground Intelligence Center, U.S. Army INSCOM. Phil, like a number of other people, has had to move to Zoom for having a positive test. So Phil, we are glad that you could join us by Zoom today, but given the challenge of moderating a conversation over Zoom, I've been happy to step in. But we will still call on Phil for his team. And then finally, we'll be joined by two UVA professors of politics, both of whom are Russia experts. To my left, physically Alan Lynch. I won't make a political joke there. And across the table, Yuri Urbanovich, who have been stalwarts in our war room conversations and have informed and educated us so much on Russia, Russian foreign policy, and national security issues, and then by other members of the war room who we'll introduce as they are called on. Before we get started, for those in the audience, please submit your questions via cards on your seats. Our staff will collect them and get them to me, and that applies to those online as well. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function online, and we will bring them into the conversation. So thank you all for being here. It's great to have you. Let's get started with the war. I want to start with where is the war today and where is it going? Starting on the ground. So I'm going to start with Ambassador Taylor. Bill, as I said before, you may actually know Eastern Ukraine better than any American official, at least up to the invasion. You spent a lot of time there, including helping supply the arms that were held up during the Trump administration that became such a political controversy at the time, but that ended up being a very far-sighted policy. It's gone through peaks and valleys, but it's clearly at a peak and a rising peak these days of U.S. support. So how is the war going on the ground, and where do we expect it to go?
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be here with this group. The Ukrainians are winning on the ground. The Ukrainians, won north of Kyiv. They pushed the Russians out. They won in the north. They pushed them out. People ask, can Putin, change, pull back? Does he always have to be? No, he's pulled back from Kyiv. He's pulled back from Chernihiv. He's moved around. And so on the ground, Ukrainians are winning. You look at the south, you look at Kherson, and this will be, I think, the key factor over the next, 2 months. Next 2 months. They're on the ground. The Russians have some 20,000 troops west of the Dnipro River in Kherson. And the Ukrainians are gradually pushing down towards that and could surround them, could force a surrender of those, or worse, because they could be wiped out. And if that happens, Bill, so just, talking about where it's going to go, one scenario is that current trends continue. That is, the Ukrainians continue to do well. and the Russians continue to do poorly on the ground in Ukraine. And if that happens, then around Kherson or Berdyansk, there's another probably clearly less defended port on the Black Sea, more toward the east, that the Ukrainians might surprise us and move on. It would have a similar effect, and that effect could be a collapse of the Russian military in Ukraine on the ground. Others will know better, much better than I, about what this means in terms of a Russian response and what happens in Moscow. But that's what I'm looking for over the next 2 months.
And Heather, how are our European friends and allies perceiving this? This is the success on the ground clearly is through the support, not just of the United States, but all of Europe. And yet it's not a NATO ally. Are they all comfortable with driving Russia out? How many feel that that should be the goal, and how many feel that the goal should be more limited than that?
Well, Bill, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'll pull on the same thread that Bill said. Our European allies are doing well, considering we are 8 months into a conflict. I describe it as sort of a European cycle of accepting the stages of grief. The first was shock. Even though the United States was providing intelligence that this could happen, I was at the Munich Security Conference a week before February 24th, and no one believed that there would be a full-scale invasion, even though Americans were telling that. And then after it happened, after that shock of it actually happening, there was anger, but there was emotionalism, because I think you have to look at Europe and how they responded by the trauma of the Second World War and what they learned from that trauma. So Central and Eastern Europe immediately and recognized Russian revisionism for a decade plus, but we told them this could not happen, felt tragically vindicated, and were providing weapons and flowing and accepting refugees that were coming over, giving nearly half of their defensive stocks to Ukraine because they understood their defense was in Ukraine. Western Europe, very different reaction. Our German colleagues, a very different reaction. Their post-World War II policy was very much designed on never providing German weapons to a conflict area. The French were very reluctant. They wanted to have that great power relationship with Putin to see if they could solve it. And so that trauma was sort of relived in all of their policies. And then from that trauma began bargaining. How do I bargain with this? Where's the off-ramp? Where's the diplomacy here? But they didn't realize there was no diplomacy here because it was existential to many for both. So now we're in a moment of fear. Fear of the unknown in many respects. And this is why Putin's nuclear saber rattling is attempting to use that fear. Russia is certainly helping with disinformation and support of both far-right groups and far-left groups, helping as we see these very large demonstrations, whether they're in Prague, whether they're in elsewhere. This is using those important tools. But for 8 months and 8 rounds of sanctions, the European Union has remained unified in support of sanctions, although we see those cracks beginning. Hungary really no longer, is in part of those sanctions. They get sort of exempted out of them. We are seeing in real time the economic cost for Europe as they head to an oil cap in December. And so for me, this is sort of going to be, as it always has been, a test of wills. Whose will is greater? Thus far, I think the Biden administration has, and very thankfully, really reinforced the importance of our European allies, has worked the problem very well. But there's concern that Europe is not playing its part. The United States is providing more military assistance. The United States has provided more macroeconomic assistance, and the Europeans have been falling behind, even though they suffer economically and suffer from the refugee crisis. And I think this is where we are at this moment, and I'm sure we'll come to talk to this. How do we define winning now that this is going to be perhaps a longer attritional war, perhaps quicker collapse, and we have to be prepared both for the collapse and the quickness of that, as well as for the long slog. We need that policy parameters. We need to make sure Europe is making that contribution that we need. But so far, so good. But there are cracks we need to be careful of.
So Andrew, how is this all perceived in Moscow? How is our accidental czar? First of all, did he commit an accident here? Was his invasion, it was clearly not the success that he expected. Was it accidental in choice, in execution, and how is that perceived now in Moscow? Do they feel that Ukraine is winning the way that Bill's laid it out, and that Europe is working through its stages of grief?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. And it's really great, especially to be reunited with Eric Edelman, who was my first boss at the Pentagon. So 30 odd years ago. So it's a real honor to share a panel with him. I am also flattered that you remember the conversation about my level of certainty about the war. I don't have any of that level of certainty about where we're headed today. And I think we all suffer from lack of accurate data. There's a lot of swirl of emotion that's generated by the horrible crimes and atrocities that Russian forces have committed on the ground in Ukraine, and a outpouring of sympathy for the plight of people inside Ukraine, which is all understandable. But understanding what Russia will do next, or where the war will transform or morph, is really beyond my capabilities these days. And every couple of days, something happens that seems like very, much disrupts any of my sense of where we are. Two, it's extremely escalatory and volatile. And we've seen events in the last couple of weeks that sort of trigger these escalatory spikes. And I think the next big one, which Ambassador Taylor just mentioned, the situation in and around Kherson is probably the next biggie. But there are other possibilities of Ukrainian strikes inside Russia proper. There have been a handful of those in recent days and weeks. There's the perennial question of what the president said at the beginning of, this war has to stay contained inside Ukraine. But the Russians may do things that make that more difficult, whether it's striking critical infrastructure. There are the mysterious unexplained attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines. There's the attack on the German railway network in recent weeks. There's just a lot of stuff happening that should make people nervous and policymakers nervous about the core goal of both keeping the conflict contained as well as avoiding any direct US-Russia or NATO-Russia military kinetic confrontation. So all that's going to be challenging. And part of it, when I just bring back something Eric and I talked about ages ago, reflects the desire on the Russian side to create dangerous situations on purpose and to use those dangerous situations to intimidate adversaries. And then in this, immediate moment, there's a kind of false hope that by making things seem as scary as possible, by bringing the specter of nuclear use into the conflict, that the US will somehow sit on the Ukrainians and force them to the bargaining table or get the Ukrainians to pull back their counteroffensive. I think the Russians are wrong in the expectation that the US has some magic button on President Biden's desk that will calibrate Ukrainian military activities 1 degree up or 5 degrees down on any day of the week. And then the final part, which comes back to your question about what's going on in Moscow, I think there's no doubt that the core of Putin's initial goal in doing this, which was very opportunistic, which was based on a lot of total misunderstanding of what Ukraine is and of what Russia's actual capabilities are. Now, all those core sort of aspirations are in no way going to be achievable. Like, I don't think we're going to have regime change in Ukraine. I don't think we're going to have a sort of deferential Ukraine that falls back under Russia's wing. I don't think the West is going to give up. I don't think the US or European partners are going to somehow give Ukraine away to Russia after everything that's happened. But the final point I'd make is if this goes on, which I think is my core assumption is like this war will drag on for months, if not years, we're just going to face lots of challenges to our staying power. And the Russian bet is that at some point we'll falter or we'll get distracted or we'll become divided internally and it won't be sustainable. I think it's not absurd that they think that. I think they're probably wrong in expecting that that would bail them out because they're just getting chewed up every day. And at some point, I mean, Eric's more knowledgeable about the military side of this, at some point, you don't have enough there to prosecute the war. And that's, I think, where the Russians are probably going to end up.
This is a great moment to bring in both Eric and Phil. Eric and Phil, in the last 2 days, I saw daily reports of death on the Russian troop side of 600 or 700 a day. For a population half as large as ours, that's twice as many COVID deaths a day as we're having right now. But these are young men who are being now conscripted into battle. How does that play out? What is driving that from a technology and weapons side, but also from the way that you keep troops and armies together? How are U.S. military leaders looking at that? How are you looking at those set of issues?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me down here to be part of the Battle Symposium. And it's great to be on a panel with three former colleagues in government and friends in post-government life, all of whom I have deep respect for. And I was trying really hard to think if there was anything I disagreed with that I heard Bill or Heather and Andrew say. I really couldn't come up with anything. If you look at kind of to drill down on what Bill was talking about in terms of where we are on the battlefield, if you look at what's going on around Bakhmut, which is where the Wagner group that Prigozhin runs has been trying to carry out a kind of mini Russian offensive to show that he can deliver more than Defense Minister Shoigu for whatever internal battling is going on inside the Putin inner circle. His forces are being literally slaughtered by the Ukrainians. If you look along the Svatove-Kremina line, again, this is in the Donbass in the east, you're seeing essentially these Russian Mobiki, the mobilized forces who were part of this recent mobilization that Putin announced, being thrown into battle without really any kit or effective training, and they're being chewed up. And you see all sorts of anecdotal evidence that some of them are quitting the battlefield, or hunkering down, being threatened with being executed if they don't go to the front. And Bill described, what was going on in Kherson as well. I'm not sure how many folks noticed it, but Reuters actually did an analysis of a number of documents that were left behind by the Russians when they pulled out of Kharkiv, and it's really quite startling to read. I know Phil and I have had an exchange about it. The documents show that most of the units that the Ukrainians were fighting were manned at the 20% level, which in the U.S. military we would regard as combat ineffective. Those are units that are barely able to function. And so I think Bill is quite right. I think the Russian military is really going to be threatened by the prospect of collapse, particularly if these pockets that are being surrounded and cut off progressively by Ukraine in the Donbass and in the south really do collapse. Because I think as just a lesson of military history is collapse in flight is quite catchy. It's something that spreads very rapidly in militaries. I think you've also seen, two other interesting phenomena in the last 48 hours, which is two pretty big Russian climb downs. One was after threatening to pull out of the Black Sea grain deal, the Russians went back in. Well, why did they do that? Well, first of all, I think they realized after having threatened to pull out that they really didn't have many good options because the Russian Black Sea fleet has been crippled by the loss of its command ship, the Moskva, which was sunk early in the conflict by the Ukrainians. It lacks air cover. It's very vulnerable. And if they needed any more evidence of that, the attack by autonomous naval vessels in the last week has demonstrated that it really can't enforce the blockade. Now, they could presumably have tried to sink merchant shipping carrying carrying grain supplies to feed the rest of the world. That wouldn't exactly endear them to the global south, where they've had some success, I would say, in terms of their information operations and public diplomacy. So they really didn't have a whole lot of choice. And what this ended up boiling down to was really an argument about market share, getting a little bit more market share for Russian wheat coming out of the Black Sea area, as well as ammonia and fertilizer for Russia, et cetera, and some commitments, presumably by the Ukrainians, not to use these lanes that are being sea lanes that are being used for commercial shipping for military purposes. The other was a pretty big climb down on all the nuclear threats that Andrew and Heather have talked about. And these are threats, I think, that were meant to intimidate the West, particularly Europe, particularly Germany, and have had some effect. And the problem with this is that it never made much military sense. It's very hard to find a use case that would be compelling for the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Ukraine. If I were a Russian senior military official right now, I would actually be a little bit concerned about the state of the Russian nuclear deterrent, by which I mean, if you're looking at a military performance that shows the effects of lack of maintenance, pervasive corruption, inattention to detail, you would, and high failure rates, for instance, of precision guided munitions. Why would you think that the nuclear arsenal is in any better shape than the conventional arsenal? Particularly since some of the institutions associated with this, like Rosatom, are notoriously corrupt. And we all know, those of us who've had some responsibility for American nuclear weapons know these things are very hard to maintain. Tritium decays, there's corrosion. It's very tough to maintain, your nuclear arsenal. So we always worried. I used to have to sign the stockpile stewardship memorandum to the president when I was undersecretary that said our nuclear weapons are safe and sure, by which we mean they're safe. They're not going to go off when you don't want them to go off. And they're sure, Mr. President or Madam President, when you actually order them to be used, they will actually go boom. And so I think that the Russians have had some second thoughts about this and how effective they are. If you go back and look at it, Putin's nuclear threats were all sort of indirect and not ever very specific. But in the last 48 hours, there have been some very specific statements, or last week. At Valdai, President Putin said, I'm not considering the use of nuclear weapons and there's no purpose in it. And then yesterday, the foreign ministry released a statement saying, look, all this talk about nuclear weapons, they reaffirmed their adherence to the January statement of all the nuclear powers. The nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. And so I think that's a very, interesting climb down. So where does that leave us? To Andrew's point, Russia basically is now down to attacking the infrastructure, civilian infrastructure of Ukraine. It's pretty much close to the bottom, I would think, of its magazine, its indigenous magazine of precision guided munitions. They fired somewhere close to 5,000 missiles into Ukraine by now. They're having to import Shahed 136 suicide drones from Iran, potentially missiles from Iran, and artillery from North Korea. And my view is the United States, because those shipments would violate a number of UN Security Council resolutions sanctioning both North Korea and Iran, ought to intercept and interdict those shipments to Ukraine, to Russia, to allow it to continue this war on civilian infrastructure. There's also, as Andrew says, the potential covert war on European infrastructure. And I think we will probably see, more of that as well. And why don't I stop there?
Phil, as you're watching all of this, how do you think Ukraine is doing in terms of the weapons it has and needs? How does Russia doing on the kind of stocks that Eric talked about? And if you're if you were advising the United States right now, what are you telling them about supplying arms to Ukraine?
So first of all, thank you so much. Sorry I can't be in the room with you, and thank you for letting me be the big Orwellian head at the table.
Great, by the way.
So a couple things that sort of I'm thinking about coming out of this conversation, with regard to what's happening and why the question you raised, Bill, in terms of why so many Russians are dying on the ground right now. I think there's sort of this unholy combination of autocratic pathologies, right? So things breaking down in the Russian system where people are being put in positions that are ineffective. But then that is sort of mixed with these issues regarding the need to deliver a win, right? Politically speaking, to cover what is essentially a pullback right now on the ground. I think we're sort of not necessarily appreciating the extent to which Russians are trying to find a new foothold a little bit further back where they can hold the line a bit. And then, so that's the political win side of it. And then it's sort of militarily covering that pullback, right? And so just throwing essentially bodies to hold the Ukrainians while the Russians try to make something a little more organized out of their next line in the sand, so to speak. And all that, I think, goes to this broader point that, as much as this conflict has changed, and I'll be the first to say that I did not foresee this level of Ukrainian capability and backbone, or this level of Russian ineffectiveness. But despite that, I think in a lot of ways, this conflict is exactly the same in terms of its character as it's been since the failure of the attempt to take Kyiv. And what I mean by that is I think Putin fell back on his second best option, the one he's used elsewhere, which is searching for a frozen conflict, right? Looking for a place where he could sort of hold Ukrainians kind of permanently in a state of risk, in a state of anticipation that would prevent them from doing the sorts of things he doesn't want them to do. Now, where that frozen conflict is going to occur, I think, has been in negotiation for months now and has moved further toward Russia than really any of us, well, I'll speak purely for myself here, but certainly than I foresaw. But it's hard for me to see how this goes any other way, right? In the sense that this is a situation where it is unrealistic for Ukraine to push into Russia. So there's sort of a natural line there, almost no matter how bad the Russian collapse gets. And Russia is clearly making moves to kind of clear a zone where they can permanently place under-equipped and under-trained people, I almost hesitate to call them soldiers, as a buffer and as that sort of portion of the frozen conflict. So kind of moving to this question of what the US should do, I think there's sort of this 2-year window right now where we look at the sort of the second half of the current presidential administration's term as a place where that's the window in which Ukraine is going to negotiate where this line is and what that looks like. And to me, that means we need to be very mindful of the effects that this support is having on our own stockpiles of certain key types of systems and munitions. But we're doing okay on that. And I would say that generally speaking, we're not totally perplexed by the notion of testing some of those supply chains and making sure that we have the capabilities to produce the things we need to produce under duress. And so that's something that is a muscle that we don't mind exercising a little bit. But I think there is this issue of sort of, keeping the foot on the gas while making sure that the Ukrainians maintain the level of pretty sophisticated control that they've employed thus far. And so I don't know that it looks a whole lot different, frankly, than it looks right now.
Thanks, Phil. I want to come back to our panelists on a point that you raised about what the next 2 years looks like on the American side, the next 2 years of the Biden administration's first term. But first, I want to draw in Alan and Yuri on what's going on in Russia right now. Alan and Yuri, we heard a few weeks ago in one of our war room sessions from Ivan Krastev raising the question of, is this Putin's war or is it Russia's war? So as we've heard now about a war where Russia first failed in its first set of missions, or maybe Putin failed in his first set of missions, They're now trying to have a stalemate on the ground, but that stalemate is one that continues to inch backwards to the east toward Russia. How is this perceived in Russia? Do they think they can change the battle lines on the ground by throwing more troops at it? Do they feel as cornered on weapons as we've heard? And is Putin cornered politically at home, or does he still have a broader support in Russia for continuing the war for 2 more years?
Thank you, Bill. I would note first, this particular war is definitely Putin's war. But having said that, the question of Russia's relationship with Ukraine is something that is a much more of a broader Russian issue. And I'd like to point out something that I think hasn't really gotten a lot of attention in the discussion of this issue, which is the attempt by post-Soviet Russia to enmesh Ukraine into a thick Russian sphere of influence, direct or indirect, by different means, political, economic, military, etc., precedes Putin. Let's remember that back in 1997, when NATO declared its intention to expand, there were 2 interesting treaties signed. One between NATO and Russia, which was designed to compensate Russia in effect for the cost of absorbing NATO expansion. Then Russia signed simultaneously a charter with Ukraine, which in effect was designed to send the signal to NATO that Russian-Ukrainian relations do not fall within the context of NATO expansion. They are a separate type of relationship. That is a point on which there has been broad consensus in Russia over the past 25 years. Second point, by launching the war, it is proven, in effect, that this question of Ukraine's international orientation is a matter of vital interest for Russia. The Russians were shocked to discover that, in fact, the war is now also a vital interest for Ukraine. They never imagined that. Their fundamentally colonialist conception of Ukraine, it's a ridiculous nation. It's not a real nation. It's nothing that can be independent of Russia. That's been falsified by this war. However, the U.S. has also proved that this war, for all of the impressive support, is less than a vital interest for the United States. And I believe that that discrepancy will persist, whatever the course of this war is, whatever the course of an armistice might be, into the long-term future. And that brings us back to the role of diplomacy, which is fundamentally the art of managing international relations by negotiations. It's difficult. It's difficult enough to think of war as an act of policy. It's even more difficult right now when the Ukrainians think they have the advantage. The Russians probably still think that their mass can somehow compensate for their inefficiencies on the ground. But what strikes me is this is not like the Winter War in 1939 and 1940, when Stalin invaded Finland because Finland wouldn't trade territory for Stalin. The Soviets suffered enormous losses, probably much larger losses proportionally to the Finns than the Russians have suffered in Ukraine today. Stalin was able to compensate. He had a 4 or 5 million man army, and he was essentially able to compensate quantity for quality. What's striking here is time after time after time, the Russians have not been able to compensate quantity for quality. They have proven the limits of the authoritarian system that Putin has developed. It is governed essentially by the traditional Russian method of spectacular acts of despotism at the top to substitute for the capacity for detailed governmental administration. So I think the fundamental Russian view, which is deeper than the Putin view, and I think we have to deal with this in the future, and especially if we're thinking at some point about how do we talk to the Russians. Ukraine can't be stabilized unless Russia agrees to it. I think that's a fundamental Russian position and will persist. It's the message they've been trying to send since at least that Russia-Ukraine charter of 1997. My last thought is this, in terms of, it's not about judging what we're doing right now, whether it should be done or not. It's about how we speak to the Russians credibly and plausibly. Almost everything the US and NATO has done since the beginning of the war on February 24th has reinforced in Putin's mind the idea that he was right to go to war in the first place. Because the fundamental purpose of that war was to prevent Ukraine from being used as a geopolitical and strategic a cudgel or wedge against Russia. And the course of the war since February, not just in Putin's mind, I think in almost any Russian national security official's mind, proves that that position was correct.
Gary? Oh, it was on. There you go.
Is it on?
Yep.
Thank you, first of all, to invite me. And of course, I'm getting very emotional speaking about war in Ukraine because I was born and raised in the Republic of Georgia, which was part of the Soviet Union at that time. And I consider Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Russians as my brothers. And when I see that they are dying and killing each other, this is something inconceivable for me. I consider it as a personal tragedy. A few words about how Ukrainians were perceived in the Soviet Union. Let me remind you that after Stalin, practically all Soviet leaders, except for Andropov, were either from Ukraine or were ethnic Ukrainians. Khrushchev was from Ukraine. His wife was full-blood Ukrainian. Brezhnev was from Ukraine, from Dnipropetrovsk, spoke with heavy Ukrainian accent. And, people of his inner circle were practically all, from Ukraine. Then Chernenko, also Soviet leader. Then Gorbachev. Gorbachev was half Ukrainian. His mother was a Ukrainian. He spoke with Southern Russian accent, which is practically Ukrainian accent. His wife was Raisa Titorenko. If some of you probably remember, they came to Charlottesville. We invited him in '93 as a keynote speaker to 250th anniversary, birthday, of Mr. Jefferson. So my point is that it is, I would say, a stereotype was in the Soviet Union that generally, there is no difference between Ukrainians and Russians because Ukrainians kept high positions, not only in the Russian Empire, if we recall all these big, Ukrainian aristocrats like Razumovsky, Skachubey, and many others. And even, imperial approach to Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians was reflected, in Russian coat of arms. 3 crowns over double-headed eagle one time was interpreted as 3 components of Russian nation. Okay, Great Russians, Little Russians, and Belarusians. So for the Russians, to accept that Ukrainians are part of the West, are some kind of opponents, is something inconceivable, So this is why, this is a real tragedy, what's going on, in the former Soviet Union as of today. Also, one interesting example, of 41 Soviet field marshals, every 4th was a Ukrainian. And there were only 41 field marshals, highest military rank, in the Soviet army. So 11 field marshals were ethnic Ukrainians. So Ukrainians traditionally kept high positions. They ruled, de facto, the Soviet Union. And suddenly to see, Russians and Ukrainians at war, is psychologically very difficult, I would say, challenge. My second point, in my mind, it was quite predictable war, in Ukraine. Moreover, I tell you, it was a postponed civil war, which should have happened, in 91, 92, when the Soviet Union collapsed, because there were so many unresolved issues, including, demarcation of borders, which were done by the Bolsheviks, and the question of Crimea. The question of Crimea is very complicated. I tell you frankly, in Russian perception, Sevastopol, Crimea, is as significant, for the Russian identity, I would say, as Norfolk or Pearl Harbor, for the Americans. And, for the Russians to see Sevastopol under control of NATO, even if it is, fantasy, or even if it is, some kind of made up, I would say, prediction, is simply inconceivable. It completely challenges, Russian identity. One more point. war in Russia is not perceived as war between Russians and Ukrainians. It is perceived as war between Russia and the United West. And, by the United West, they mean almost 60 countries that fought against, one Russia. This is how, at least, it is perceived. And this is how it is amplified by Russian propaganda. So I tell you frankly that I am not so optimistic about the outcome of this war, because if you look, retrospectively at Russia's war, most of them had begun for Russia very unsuccessfully. Let it be, the time of troubles. Poles and Lithuanians were in Moscow, then they were expelled. Look, at invasion of Napoleon. He was in Moscow, then he was expelled. Look at war, of Hitler. He came, almost to Moscow, then he was expelled, and the outcome of this war. So for Russians, when they participate in war, it helps them, I would say, to mobilize, their people, their economies, their enterprises. Today, Russian military industrial enterprises work, 3 shifts, So they at least mobilized people, to consider this war as a patriotic war. Again, I repeat, because, we are not fighting against Ukraine. We are fighting with a united West, which always wanted to destroy Russia. And unfortunately, again, I repeat, unfortunately, this myth, is quite popular among Russian population. So I tell you, there are many, especially among Russian intelligentsia who left the country. Over 1 million of them left the country. Many of them are specialists, IT specialists. They settled, in Kazakhstan, in Georgia, in Armenia, in Turkey, in Serbia, and other places. It's a big loss, for Russia. But at the same time, a majority of the population, I would say around 75%, they remain in support of this, battle about, Russia's survival, I would say. The question is, almost Shakespearean, to be or not to be, because this is what is on their mind, that the West decided to destroy us, and we need, to mobilize all our resources. As you noticed, we are speaking, very much about, military aspects of this war. Russians, in the last at least, months, they decided to use mostly precision weapons to destroy, energy infrastructure. And situation is awful, in Ukraine, because, even Kiev, was experienced suffering from outages. And they will continue to do it. So my understanding is, of course, that more active intervention of the United States, on the stage of diplomacy, is extremely important. And I think, and I would agree with my dear colleague and friend Ellen Lynch, that the diplomacy, unfortunately, had failed. There were, 2 options, for diplomacy to win. Of course, making concessions, and maybe making not very appreciative, concessions for especially, Ukrainians. But I think that diplomacy had failed. There were chances to avoid, not to give reason, to Putin and his entourage, to wage war. Thank you.
So we heard, I want to come back to the panelists now for some quick responses on a few things we just heard. We heard, on the one hand, it's not been a vital interest to the United States, but on the other hand, the war is perceived in Russia as, on the one hand, at some level, a civil war that they're still grieving from the loss, but a civil war precipitated by a united West. How united is the West? How vital is this to us? And to what Phil Potter said, over the next 2 years, while the Biden administration is still in this term, not knowing what would come next, we started to see cracks, at least on the United States side of the United West, with both the left of the Democratic Party and parts of the Republican Party suggesting that it's not a blank check, that we should go to the negotiating table. How do you all perceive how united we are, how vital this is, and how diplomacy will play out? Start with Andrew. I want to start with Andrew because I got the email from Andrew about how united we are at 8:30 this morning.
So I know nothing about US domestic politics, and I'm a stranger in this country increasingly. The level of bipartisan support for Ukraine has remained quite high throughout the war, and you see Republican and Democratic voters in the polls I've looked at suggesting that 60% of them or higher sympathize with the plight of Ukraine, want to be supportive. And the administration, I think, has tried to take advantage of that and has pushed through these massive assistance programs that are in the tens of billions. I think we're up to now like $19 billion or something in military assistance. So it's possible to imagine all of that assistance continuing. We'll see what happens on Tuesday in the midterm elections and Congress's new configuration. I don't know anything about that stuff, but the U.S. is the key, most important part of the Western support. We provide inordinate backbone, not inordinate, but we provide considerable backbone in military, tactical, intelligence terms that enhance the lethality of the Ukrainian side. And I don't think that is going to crack. I think that the Pentagon and other parts of the U.S. national security bureaucracy are 130% engaged in this fight to make sure the Ukrainians are not left to face the Russians on their own.
Eric?
I wanted to say a few words about diplomacy as one of the, I think, 4 practitioners sitting at the table. I'm looking at my former comrade in arms, Steve Mull. Alan is quite right. Diplomacy is the adjudication of national differences by negotiation rather than war. But I think we, in the public debate about this, sometimes see it as somehow an alternative to war, or that it's a self-licking ice cream cone of some kind, that it exists for its own sake. But diplomacy can never be divorced from the threat of military force, particularly when you're trying to end a war. And diplomacy is a technique for accomplishing some national interest. Now, Alan, I think, quite rightly said that there is a difference in the balance of stakes here, that the Russians have defined this, and Yuri was saying the same, as a war of national survival. And for the United States, it's not a vital interest in the sense that the United States national survival is not at stake. That doesn't mean, however, I think, that we don't have a very, very important interest in the outcome of this conflict, because we are a party to a number of diplomatic undertakings that are being held at risk here by President Putin's war of aggression that essentially threatens the international order that has been established since the end of the Cold War. And what I have in mind are, first of all, the Charter of Paris, which established the OSCE, in which Russia recognized Ukraine in its current configuration, the Treaty of Peace that was signed by Russia, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, by the way, Alan, was not a treaty. I was involved in negotiating that. It was a point of contention between us and the Russians that it was not a legally binding document. But we did also offer Ukraine assurances at the time of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when it gave up its claim to the nuclear weapons left on its soil, one of the issues that Yuri, I think, was adverting to, that was left unregulated by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if essentially we allow Putin to succeed in through a war of aggression, winning ill-gotten gains we will be putting the entire international order at risk. What lesson will Xi Jinping, who now has established essentially a almost parallel personalized kind of dictatorship in China after the last party Congress, what lessons will he draw from this if we allow this to stand? So to me, the issue is not, is there going to be diplomacy or is there not going to be diplomacy? Although it is not true that every war ends with a diplomatic solution or with a peace treaty. Some conflicts just sort of, sit there for a while and then, there's a resumption later on.
Korean War, 60 years later.
But yeah, my view is what we want is a settlement that resolves this issue in a way that doesn't allow Russia to undertake aggression against Ukraine again in the future. That seemed to me to be a very important U.S. national interest. So the issue in my mind, and I'd be really curious about my former State Department colleagues' view of this, is not, to have diplomacy or not. It's going to be on what grounds does the diplomacy take place. And I think we're not yet in a place where the Russian side is ready to recognize what I think is the sense of the panel has been the incipient military result on the battlefield, and that will allow negotiations to take place. And I think it's actually potentially dangerous to be talking about diplomacy now, because it could be very demoralizing to the Ukrainians who are giving their lives on the battlefield to try and get the conditions set for potentially a more fruitful diplomatic undertaking.
Bill, can I?
Please, in fact, we're coming up at 10 o'clock, but I've just gotten clearance from the boss here, Christina, that we can go a few minutes over 10. We will collect Q&A, and we have 2 more hours to get through Q&A, and this session going into the economics will, I'm sure, connect to a number of these issues. So please, Bill and Heather, please come in.
Just a quick point about vital interests. Okay, we're not going to send troops. It's not a vital interest for the United States in Ukraine. It's an important interest, as Eric has just described, for all kinds of reasons. I can't believe that it's a vital interest for the Russians. I mean, I can't believe that. I could, we can talk, Yuri, but that's not a vital interest. It's a Putin vital interest, maybe, but it's not a vital interest for Russia. I'll tell you who it's a vital interest for, and that's the Ukrainians. This is existential for the Ukrainians. I mean, if they lose, there is no Ukraine. So that's why they're fighting so hard. And that's why they will continue to fight. And that's why they will, no matter what the outcome of the next 3 months, I think it'll be kind of along the line Eric's just described, or longer, as Heather has described. The Ukrainians will continue to fight because they have no choice. They're going to win in the end. They're going to win in the end.
Heather, please bring us home. How vital is it for us? How vital is it for our European partners? How united will we be moving forward?
Oh boy. Well, thank you. I originally, when the war began, I agreed it was a Putin's war. It was Putin's vision of how to create Russia as a great power status, and Russia cannot be great without its own understanding, historical understanding of Ukraine. I have since moved, and I actually believe this is Russia. This is a war with Russia. The Russian people who are largely in support of this, whether they have a choice or not, whether they have fled the partial mobilization of that, this is Russia, and Russia has been trying to self-isolate itself over time. So I do believe in many ways, with great regret, it is a broader construct, but certainly Putin is leading it. On the vital national interest, I think we all sort of felt like we went up on that. And this is why it's so important to explain to the American people what is at stake, because they've just placed $45 billion in that, and we're going to be doing more. So what is at stake? So the question could not be more important. It is not existential to the United States, but it is existential to our allies. It is existential if we want the United Nations Charter to function, if we don't believe in war crimes or atrocities, if we believe in territorial integrity and sovereignty. Because if you believe what Vladimir Putin's vision of this, well, Alaska may be a question mark in his minds because that was something that was, I mean, this is where this goes. And this is what's been happening since 2014 with the 20% of occupation of Georgian lands, which led to 2008, which in 2014 led to the 7% occupation of Ukraine, which led in 2022 to the 20% occupation. Where does this end? And so it really is, I like to say, the international system runs the future of Ukraine. It's our choice. We can choose to defend the international system as we understand it, or we can say, you're right, this isn't worth it. You take it, it's yours, and it will continue on. And that destabilization will fundamentally challenge all of our interests. So the question is so important. Because if we don't understand what is at stake, what our interests are, why are we putting our treasure, our talent, why are our allies supporting this, then we really don't know what we're doing. And I think that, again, is part of this. And I could not agree with you more, Yuri. We are seeing the second collapse of the Soviet Union. This is just another ripple effect that has not been resolved. That's why we have to prepare ourselves, in my view, for a decade long of instability. So we better get that question right. We better have all of our tools to be able to manage that instability, hopefully prevent it, hopefully mitigate it. But as I talk to colleagues in the Baltic states, after they witnessed Irpin and Bucha, they said, I will never allow my territory to be occupied, because they understand what is at stake. So I think we just have to be very focused, very clear, and very honest about what we are willing to protect and defend, and the consequences if we are not. Bill.
Thank you, Heather. I want to bring in Phil for a final closing word on the panel that he should have led, and we're delighted that he was still able to join us. Phil, any closing thoughts for us before we take a short break?
I certainly would never try to go in a serious way after those closing remarks from Heather. I think that really summed up what we're saying sort of beautifully. Just to thank everybody for their forbearance with me on the screen. And as always in these conversations, I learned a lot. And so I am very happy that this is a broader conversation that could be shared with the Miller Center community.
Phil, thank you. And thanks again to all our panelists. We will all come back together. We'll slightly play musical chairs here, not that someone will be left out, but people will be taking different places as we take on our next discussion, which will be about the economics of the crisis, how the sanctions against Russia, the shipments of grain to the global economy, and the broader global economic and technological forces are shaping the conflict, and vice versa. So we'll come back at 10:15. It's 5 after 10 now. We'll see you all in 10 minutes.